All right, so today we are starting our discussion of the central nervous system. If you remember, when we classified last session, the nervous system, we divided the nervous system anatomically into the central nervous system, which is formed by the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, and those are the nerves that would be carrying the signals towards the CNS or from the CNS. So either afferent or efferent nerves. Starting first with the structure of the brain, of the CNS. The brain is formed of four main regions. We have the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. So the brain is divided into four regions. Those are the cerebrum, diencephalon, brainstem, and cerebellum. Looking first at the cerebrum. The cerebrum is formed of an outer gray matter that will be shown those elevations and depressions on the outer surface. We call the elevation on here, this is a gyrus, and those shallow depressions between the gyri, those are the sulci or sulcus. We have deep depressions like the one between the cerebrum on here and the cerebellum. We call those are fissures. So a fissure is a deep groove like the one in here between the right and left cerebral hemispheres. So the cerebrum is formed of two cerebral hemispheres. Its outer layer is what we call the cerebral cortex. The inner part of the cerebrum is what we call the white matter. And the white matter of the cerebrum, it's connecting the right and left cerebral hemispheres to one another. We call this is the corpus callosum. So let me first clarify what is the difference between the gray matter and the white matter. Gray matter in any part of the central nervous system that we're gonna discuss it. It's gonna be the part of the central nervous system that will be formed of the cell bodies of the neurons and unmyelinated nerve fibers. Or the axons. The white matter it's gonna be formed by the myelinated nerve fibers or axons. So again, we're looking here at the cerebrum, and the cerebrum is formed of two cerebral hemispheres, right cerebral hemisphere, left cerebral hemisphere. Each cerebral hemisphere is going to be formed by an outer gray matter. All this is the gray matter of the cerebrum. We call this is my cerebral cortex. Cerebral cortex. And to the inside, what's going to be connecting the right and left cerebral hemispheres is a bundle of myelinated nerve fibers. So it's a white matter. And the white matter that will be connecting the right and left cerebral hemispheres, it's what we call the corpus callosum. If we're looking at the cerebral cortex, we will see cerebral cortex, it's not smooth. It has elevations. We call this elevation a gyrus. And we've got shallow grooves. Those are called the sulci or a sulcus. And we've got deep grooves. Those are the fissures. Like what fissures that we need to remember? Like the transverse fissure between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. This is my cerebellum on here. Another fissure is the one that is located between the right and left cerebral hemispheres. This is called my longitudinal fissure. Longitudinal fissure. This is a longitudinal fissure. So we've got here longitudinal fissure. We've got here the transverse fissure. We're also going to be dividing the cerebrum, both of the cerebral hemispheres, into lobes. We've got the frontal lobe, the part of the brain that will be corresponding to the frontal bone, the part that will be in contact with the parietal bone. This is going to be my parietal lobe. The part that is in contact with the occipital bone of the skull, this is going to be my occipital lobe. And on the side here, we've got the temporal lobe. So we've got frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal. And those are the same names like what we've seen in the cranial bones. We've got another lobe deeper here to the temporal lobe. We call this as my insula or insular lobe. So again, the cerebral hemispheres are going to be formed by how many lobes? Are formed by 5 lobes. Frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal, and insula. Again, we're looking here at the outer part of my brain, of the cerebrum. Remember, the outer part of the cerebrum that we're looking at, it's called the cerebral cortex. This is the gray matter of the cerebrum. And this is the largest part of the brain. It's representing 40% of the brain mass. What is the importance of the cerebral cortex? This outer part of the cerebrum on here, all this. What is the importance of the cerebral cortex? This is your conscious mind. It's going to be responsible for awareness, sensory perception, voluntary motor movement. It initiates the voluntary motor signals. It's going to be responsible for normal communication, memory storage, and understanding. So this is all my conscious mind. So think of it this way. So if a person got in an accident and you wanted to check his consciousness, check if he is fully conscious or not. So what would you ask him? What do you think? If you wanted to test a person's consciousness, do you know where you are? Do you know what day is it today? What is the name of the city we're in? Do you have any children? Can you move your hand? Can you follow the light with your eyes? Can you hear me? Sensory, motor, memory. So all this is what we test to check the consciousness. Those are the functions of my cerebral cortex. Each cerebral hemisphere is going to be controlling the contralateral side of the body. What this means? This means that if I touch with my left hand, the part of the brain that is responsible to perceive this sensation is in my right cerebral hemisphere. If, for example, I am moving my right arm, the motor movement got initiated in my left cerebral hemisphere. So the left cerebral hemisphere is controlling the contralateral side of my body in terms of sensations, motor movement. We have three types of functional brain areas in the cerebral cortex. We have the motor areas, sensory areas, and the association areas. Motor areas, from the name, they are the site for the initiation and the control of the voluntary movement. And those are located mainly in the frontal lobe of the cerebral hemispheres. Sensory areas, those are responsible for conscious awareness of sensation. I can feel, I can hear, I can see. I am aware of the presence of the stimulus and I can detect it. This is the function here of the sensory areas, as they are located in the parietal, temporal, occipital, and insular lobes. All the rest of the cerebral hemisphere is gonna be mainly containing sensory areas. Compared to the motor areas, they are mainly localized and kept in my frontal lobe. Association areas are also going to be located in the parietal, temporal, occipital, and insular lobes around the sensory areas, and their function here is to integrate the diverse information, allowing the perception of those sensations. So For example, on here, what is the difference between sensation and perception? So if I'm writing something down like this, can you see this here? Can you read what I did just right here? Can you read this? Can you see it? Yes, you can see it. Can you read it? Can you know what I mean by this? No. This is the difference between sensation and perception. So I see the figures. I can see. I can see. This is a sensation. But this sensation doesn't have any meaning for me. I can't interpret it. I don't have perception of this sensation. So if I don't know French and I hear people talking in French, can I hear? Yes, I can hear. Can I understand what they are saying? No. So I have a sensation, but I don't have a perception of this sensation. So the perception of the sensation is taking place in the association areas. My ability to hear, my ability to see, it's the function of the sensory areas. So this is the difference between sensation and perception. Sensation is your ability to become aware of the presence of the sensation. But the perception, the function of the association area is the perception here. It's gonna rely on your ability to interpret those sensations. So what? So this is an owl on here, leaf, water, and a bird. All right, in hieroglyphics. This is simply my name. All right, M-I-N-A. All right, so next time, when you see an owl, a leaf, a water, bird, you know that this is an M, this is an I, this is an N, this is an A. All right, so now you've learned, you stored this in your memory. So whenever you see it again, what's gonna happen? You get the sensation through the visual sensory area, but the association area will integrate the sensations that you did just receive with the memory that you have built now. So you would be able to see an owl, yes, and this in hieroglyphic is an M. You can see a bird, and this in hieroglyphics, it's an A, and so on. So you build a memory to integrate this sensation with whenever you get exposed to it later on. So you would be able to have a perception of the sensation. Does this make sense? All right, great. All right, so our first question for the in-class activity for today, what is the largest part of the brain? And the only part that we have mentioned. Cerebrum. Cerebrum. All right, so cerebrum is formed by the cerebral hemispheres. Outer part is the cerebral cortex, which is the gray matter, and the inner part is the corpus callosum that attaches the two cerebral hemispheres. How many of you are right-handed? Yeah, right-handed. And how many left-handed? Just put left in the chatting box if you are left-handed. Left. Yeah, you see. What is meant have being right-handed or left-handed? It's going to be determined according to which cerebral hemisphere is the dominant cerebral hemisphere that you have. So if I'm right-handed, the dominant cerebral hemisphere, it's going to be the left cerebral hemisphere. And this is the most common. If I'm left-handed, this means what? This means that the dominant cerebral hemisphere is my right cerebral hemisphere. And it's going to be less common. All right, so left cerebral hemisphere is usually dominant, and it's connected to math, language, skills, and logic. Right cerebral hemisphere is connected with insight, visual spatial skills, and creativity. So this doesn't mean that you have one or the other. We have different levels of all of those abilities, but with different levels. All right, so what is meant by visual spatial skills? What do we mean by visual spatial skills? What do you think? Visual spatial skills is you are able to have some kind of feeling of the measurements, the sizes, directions. So you don't have to take the measurements of a table, for example, to know that it's going to fit in your dining room. Or you don't have to have the map in front of you in order to imagine what alternative direction that you can take to reach your destination. All right, those are the visual spatial skills. Looking here at the different brain areas, this is very important, a very important diagram for our last lab exam. It's a 5 stars diagram, highly important, showing the different brain areas of the cerebral cortex. Remember, all this is my frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is separated from the parietal lobe by this depression here. This is called my central sulcus. Anterior to the central sulcus, we've got an elevation here. We call this is my pre-central gyrus. Pre-central gyrus is the site for the primary motor cortex. This is where I've got the nerve cells that are going to be responsible to initiate the motor movements of my skeletal muscles. This is my pre-motor the primary motor cortex or the pre-central gyrus. Primary motor cortex or the pre-central gyrus. You see on here, this is how your body is going to be represented on your pre-central gyrus. See, I have a very large representation, for example, of my face. A large representation of my fingers and hand. Much less representation to my back. And relatively smaller representation of my toes compared to my fingers. Something that you can notice on here. What this means, why do I care about the representation of the different parts of the body in my brain? Because those are the dedicated nerve cells. Remember, what is actually forming the gray matter that we are looking at right now as the cerebral cortex? Those are the cell bodies of the nerve cells. So when I say that I have a larger representation of the cerebral cortex, this means that I have a much greater number of nerve cells dedicated to control the motor movement in this specific part of the body. So which one do you have a better control of? Your fingers or your toes? What do you think? Can you type with your fingers better or your toes better? Fingers, right? I have a much better control on my fingers compared to my toes. Why? I have a much greater area in the cerebral cortex, which is dedicated to send out messages to my fingers, and a much smaller part of the cerebral cortex dedicated for the motor control of my toes. So have much greater representation on the cerebral cortex means I have a much better control. I can perform a much more complicated tasks. And you see here a large brain area that will be controlling the motor movement of your face. What I mean by the face on here, what do I mean by the face? It's all the facial muscles, all the facial muscles. Your facial expression is responsible for a huge part of your ability to communicate. So those muscles in your face, when they contract, relax, changing your facial expression, they give you the ability to communicate with others. So you need to have a much larger area in your cerebral cortex to allow the movements on here of those facial muscles. Muscles that will be responsible for swallowing, also located in the head and neck. So to initiate the swallowing, it's under voluntary control. You start to contract your tongue. This is part of the voluntary motor control. It's going to be represented here in the precentral gyrus. Lips, jaw. In front of the precentral gyrus, we've got an area that will be responsible for the eye movement, just the eye movement. Frontal eye field. and I have a dedicated area for one of the most complicated tasks that we are performing as humans, which is speech. Speech. We call this area on here, this large area. You see how large is it compared to even the premotor, precentral gyrus, the primary motor cortex. This large brain area is responsible for language production and language output. This is called the Broca's area. Broca's area. So again, what is the function of Broca's area? It's the motor control of the muscles that will be modifying the sounds into a language. So how do you speak? You are pushing air out from your lungs, and this air is going to be causing the vibration of the vocal cords in your larynx. And then you're going to be modifying those sounds by contracting, relaxing a huge number of muscles. You're moving your tongue, you're contracting, relaxing your cheeks, your lips. So for example, just to give you an impression about how do I create a language, how do you speak? As we mentioned last time, can you say "oh" without pursing your lips? Oh, oh. Can you say "oh" without pursing your lips when you're smiling? Can you say "oh" and smile at the same time? You can't. All right, so try to imagine on here the number of muscles that need to contract. For example, can you say that without moving your tongue? When you're sticking your tongue against your palate, you can't. All right, so in order for you to modify the sounds emitted from the larynx, you need to perform fast muscle contractions and highly coordinated muscle contractions. And those muscle contractions are going to be mediated by the Broca's area. This is a primary motor site for the language production. The muscles responsible to modify the sounds for you to speak. We're still looking at the frontal lobe of the cerebral. It's going to be mainly in the dominant hemisphere. It has a lesser presence in the other hemisphere as well. It's bilateral, but it's going to be much highly active in the dominant hemisphere. Broca's area. Broca's area. All right, so moving on to another area in the frontal lobe. This is my prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is going to be responsible for working memory, task management, memory recall, solving complex multitask problems. All right, so when you are in an exam trying to solve a question, you're thinking, you're trying to find an answer, so you find yourself holding your frontal parts of the head, right? All right, what you're pointing at, what your body is pointing at, it's pointing to the prefrontal cortex. This is a site for memory recall, task management, multitasking, and problem solving complex problems. All right, this is again what we call this area on here. What do we call this area? It's what is the name of this area here? Prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex. In the parietal lobe, what we see on here, just behind my central sulcus, I've got my post-central gyrus. And the post-central gyrus, it's the primary somatosensory cortex. What I mean by somatosensory, you remember last class? What is somatosensory? You remember we divided the nervous system into either sensory or motor. Remember from last class? Sensory or motor. And sensory was divided into either visceral or somatic. And remember, somatic means what? I'm carrying sensations from skin, muscles, and joints. I'm carrying sensations from skin, muscles, and joints. Remember, we've seen also somatic motor. This is a voluntary control of the skeletal muscles. So primary somatosensory cortex, I am a sensory cortex. Sensory. I'm responsible to detect what? I'm responsible to detect somatic sensations. Somatic sensations. This is how your body is going to be represented on the primary motor, the primary somatosensory cortex. So you are detecting much more sensations from your face, head and neck. You definitely is detecting, you're definitely detecting much more sensations from your fingers and hand compared to the skin of your back. So if you wanted to buy a new shirt or a dress and you want to feel how good is the texture, would you touch it with your fingertips or would you touch it with your back? If you want to check the quality of the garment, would you touch it with your fingertips or with the skin of your back? Fingertips. Why fingertips? Because they have much larger number of receptors. And as they have large numbers of receptors to detect better sensations, they have a greater brain site that will be decoding those signals. So you see, I have more receptors. This is one thing, but those receptors are also sending out to more nerve cells to decode the signals. So I will have a much better sensation in my fingertips compared to my toes, for example, or my back. Just next to it, we've got the somatosensory association cortex. And remember, association cortex are the brain areas that are going to be responsible for the interpretation of the sensation. So I touch a surface, but I can feel it. I can feel it, but I won't know that this is soft or it's not soft. Why? Because I have a problem in my somatosensory association cortex. You see on here, in the insula, we've got the primary cortical area responsible for taste, because this is gustatory cortex. Gustatory cortex. Gustatory cortex. Do you remember a movie called Ratatouille? You remember Ratatouille? Yeah. Do you remember the name of the chef in Ratatouille that appears to him? Gusto. 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 Gusto is to taste. Gustatory means to taste. Taste. So gustatory cortex is a brain area in the insula that is responsible to allow the taste sensation. So you've got the receptors in your tongue, in your pharynx, and those receptors are going to be sending the signals to the insula, to the primary gustatory cortex, for the gustatory cortex to decode those signals into sweet, sour sensations. All right. Looking posterior to gustatory cortex, we've got the primary auditory cortex and the auditory association area that is going to be located around it. So this is my primary auditory cortex, and this is the auditory association area. So auditory cortex, primary auditory cortex is going to be the site for you to be able to hear. And the association area is going to be responsible for you to interpret what you are hearing. So for example, if a person has an auditory association area problem, and I'm speaking to him, would he be able to hear me? Yes or no? Would he be able to hear me? Yes, he can. He can hear me. Can he understand what he's hearing? Can he interpret what he's hearing? No. So if I have a problem in association area, auditory association area as an example, and I have a totally normal auditory cortex, primary auditory cortex, I can hear, but I can't understand what I'm hearing. So think of it, you're hearing a language that you don't know. All right, so I can't understand any Japanese, for example. And I hear people speaking in Japanese. Would I be able to hear them? Yes, you can hear them, but can you understand what they are saying? No. I can hear, but I can't understand. This is the difference between auditory cortex, primary auditory cortex, and the auditory association area. Here, association area is responsible for the interpretation. What if a person got a stroke affecting the primary auditory cortex? Would he be able to hear? Here we're affecting the primary cortex, auditory cortex. Here at this point, he won't be able to hear. I won't be able to hear. If the primary auditory cortex is affected. Just behind the auditory areas, we've got a large brain area called the Wernicke's area. And the Wernicke's is going to be responsible for the production of the written and spoken language. What this means? So think of it, Wernicke's is the processing site for the words that you are going to be speaking. So you've got the words that you want to speak. But you didn't speak them. All right, so we're looking here. Wernicke's is the area that would be preparing the words that you're going to be speaking with. And the areas that will allow you to transform those into sounds for you to speak with is going to be the Broca's area. So if a person has a problem with Wernicke's, he will have the ability to speak. So he's going to be speaking, but you won't understand what he's saying because the site for the processing of the information is going to be affected. Where is the concept? So where is the main idea? I can't understand what he is talking about. All right, he's speaking so fast, he can't formulate the words, he has no problem formulating those words, emitting the sounds. But I can't understand what is the whole idea he is willing to deliver. So he's talking and we left, the sun was rising, beautiful day, and yesterday I can't feel, and we've got away, and then we have the car in here and we left, and then we find the moon. So you see, speaking, you can understand the words, but when you are following my words, you wouldn't have been able to understand anything. As there is no main idea that you are able to understand from what I'm saying. This is if Wernicke's area is affected. But if a person had a stroke and the Broca's area is the one that got affected, the problem now it's not in the processing of the idea that this person is willing to say. He has the idea, but he has difficulty to formulate the sounds to speak out those ideas. So for example, we went to the beach yesterday and I met my daughter. So you've got the idea, but you can see that I can't speak fluently. So I have slowing down of the speech. All right. In this case, I have Broca's area problem. Exactly. Exactly. Processing the information, you might know what you want to say. If your Wernicke's is affected, if Wernicke's is affected, you know what you want to say, but you don't put them into words to deliver your idea. You don't form the whole sentence in a coherent way to deliver your idea. This is if Wernicke's was affected. But there is something that you want to say, and you know what you want to say. And it might be making sense for you that you are actually delivering the idea that you want to say, but you don't say it. But you can speak. You can formulate the sounds, you can speak, no problem with that. You know what you want to say, but you're not saying it. All right? Very Broca's, you are fully aware of what you want to say, but you have difficulty transforming those sentences processed in Wernicke's into sounds that you can speak. All right. To find angry, would he be able to understand? Yes. So it's gonna be different. The type of sensation in this case is gonna be emotional analysis, and the emotional analysis, it's gonna be relying on multiple association areas, not only the ones from hearing. I believe you were asking about, would we understand if the person is angry or not when we hear? So you can detect this by facial expression, by the tone, how loud is it, vibrations, many other things other than the the auditory association area function. So we have other association areas that will be detecting many other sensations for you to be able to get the concept or get the feeling of whether the person in front of you is angry or not, or so on. All right, too fun. But a main part is going to be from the auditory. So if you are hearing the radio, for example, if you are hearing the radio and you don't know the culture of the people speaking this language, so you might feel that they are fighting, but they are not. See what I mean? So you analyze from your own perspective, but as you don't have the information to rely on, because you haven't been to this country before, so you might interpret those tones in a different way than the original speakers. All right. Going to all the way to the posterior part of the cerebral cortex, this is my occipital lobe. As the occipital lobe, we can see on here the primary visual cortex, which is responsible for you to be able to see. So if it got affected by a stroke, I will have blindness. I can't see anything. And a huge association area on here around the visual cortex This is my visual association area, and this is what gives the meaning to everything that I see. So if I see colors, for example, black, if the association area is not working, I wouldn't know that this is black. I can see it, but I don't know it. I see a dog. I would see a dog. I can see it, but I don't know that this is a dog. And so on. All right, so I fail to interpret what I see if the association area, visual association area, is affected. All right, so this is a very, very important diagram. Also, other important diagrams that we've seen were these two diagrams. Those are less important because simply not a lot of information on those diagrams. Here, those are three stars diagrams. So looking here at the transverse cerebral fissure, again between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. We've got the longitudinal fissure, which splits the cerebrum into right and left cerebral hemispheres. All right, we can have a break for 10. We come back, discuss more about the brain. All right, any questions before we leave for a break? Any questions? All right.